Today we're going to talk about the lentil soup story. How many of you remember the lentil soup story? Oh.
Something about lentils.
Okay.
I know the stone soup story.
No. This is from Genesis. This is
lentil soup.
The lentil soup story. All right. We all remember Father Abraham, right? And his son by Sarah was Isaac, right? And he married his cousin Rebecca because he sent the servant to the home country to fetch her. Well, Abraham sent the servant to the home country to get a bride from among their own family. And Isaac and Rebekah were married, according to the current version of the text, they were married for 20 years with no children, which was a very serious thing in those days. And finally, after Isaac entreats the Lord for his wife, she conceives. But it's a difficult pregnancy. And so she goes and consults the Lord and is told that not only does she have twin sons, in her womb that are fighting each other, but that these are two entire peoples. I mean, imagine those of you who have actually given birth. Imagine finding out that you don't just have two kids in there; you got two whole countries. And that they don't get along. I mean, how many of you know who Amy Jill Levine is? Okay, she's the professor of New Testament studies at Emory, the last I heard, so respectable. She's also Jewish, right? And she wrote a book called The Misunderstood Jew, which said that the moment Jesus opened his mouth and started telling the parable of the prodigal son, a certain man had two sons. Everybody in the audience would have known several things, one of them being the boys didn't get along. The father was completely ineffectual at trying to keep peace in the family. And she brings forth the examples of Cain and Abel, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, David and his brothers, and David's sons. So there's a very long tradition of brothers not getting along. And so when Rebekah gives birth at long last, the firstborn comes out hairy all over and red. They name him Esau, but he was nicknamed Edom, which is the Hebrew word for red. And the other baby had grabbed the firstborn by the heel, and they called him Jacob, which is related to the Hebrew words for heel grabber. And that's where we start. The lads grew up, and Esau was a man skilled in hunting, a man of the field. And Jacob was a simple man, a dweller in tents. Well, that word simple in Hebrew is tam. It usually means innocent or morally upright, but it can also mean slick. Or slippery. I mean, the Pharisees in the time of Jesus had a reputation as being slick Jews. They could argue anything, and make whatever point they had decided was the right one seem to be the right one, whether it actually was or not. So, and we are still trying to figure out Jacob's character 20 chapters later, when he is reunited with his lost son Joseph and is received by the Pharaoh. I mean, we don't know, is he simple, upright, slick, you know, a bit on the cagey side, or is he just all of it at once, which is probably the truth, because Jacob is a complex character. And Isaac loved Esau for the game that he brought him, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Okay, parents playing favorites. Boy, that won't end badly. And you know, there's another very interesting expression here. Robert Alter, who is a professor of modern Hebrew literature, translates, loved Esau for the game that he brought him. The Hebrew actually says, for the game in his mouth. So we don't know if Esau had a taste for game that he had hunted and killed, if Isaac had a taste for the game that Esau killed and brought him, or if Esau is supposed to be like some monstrous lion who carries his prey around in his mouth. The concrete version of the image would be the latter. But Rebekah loved Jacob, and we have no idea why. Just like we don't know why God preferred Abel to Cain. And Jacob prepared a stew, and Esau came from the field, and he was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, let me gulp down some of this red stuff, for I'm famished. Okay, that's not a standard translation, because they usually clean it up a bit. But the word in Hebrew that is used for Esau wanting to be fed appears nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible, which has only about 8,000 words in Hebrew to it. So, but in rabbinical Hebrew, from about 1,000 years later, the word refers to what you do when you feed the animals. The English equivalent, the English one-word equivalent would be like slopping the hogs. You know, slop me some of this. And what Esau calls what Jacob is making, because it's a lentil soup, and that's why this is the lentil soup story. What Esau calls it is literally ha'adom hazeh, this red. I mean, he can't even remember the simple word for stew, because Esau is inarticulate appetite. When Joyce told me several times about when she was in Sunday school as a girl, and remember, this is nearly 60 years ago. And the Sunday school teacher read this story, and of course was reading out of the King James, which actually does mention lentils. Pottage of lentils is what it says. The kids don't know. The kids were North Carolina kids. A lot of them were a generation off the farm. They didn't know from lentils. So the Sunday school teacher made a cultural substitution for them. Pinto beans. And that they got. Because every last one of them, this wasn't a rich church, so every last one of them had pinto beans more times than they could count already, and would go on to keep eating pinto beans for most of their lives. And one of them, maybe, I can't remember if it was Joyce or one of the others, pipes up and says, Esau wasn't very smart, was he? And the teacher allows that, well, that's kind of the point. So Esau says to Jacob, let me gulp down some of this red, for I'm famished. Therefore is his name called Edom, which is Hebrew for red. So it's like saying, that's why they call him red. And Jacob says, and listen to the very careful way he phrases it. Sell now your birthright to me. It's like verbal breadcrumbs that in the end lead back to Jacob. And Esau said, look, I'm about to die. What good is a birthright to me? And Jacob says, swear to me now. And he swore to him. And he sold his birthright to Jacob. The birthright essentially said that whoever had it, which was always the oldest son, pretty much, would inherit the vast bulk of the father's estate, because the idea was to pass everything on to one person who would then act as the head of the family and would safeguard the family's interests and do what he could to increase their property so that they would all have something to live on. And I was watching, I happened to catch Charles Stanley very briefly, who points to this passage and says that it's an example of going after the right thing in the wrong way. Okay, I'll give him that. But then he says, Jacob didn't need to get the birthright. He already had it. Well, no, he didn't. That's why he had to resort to something kind of underhanded like this in order to get it. What he had was God's love, which is a different matter. So Jacob said to Esau, swear to me now, and he swore to him, and he sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and he drank and he rose and he went off, and Esau spurned the birthright. And boy, wasn't that quick. Boom, 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 boom. And it's just as quick in the Hebrew. He ate and he drank, he got up and he went off. And what in the world can that possibly mean to us? Most of us, I expect, have seen either online or heard on television or wherever what the current opinion of Christians is. What is it?
That's what you ask.
Christians are supposed to be joyless people who want to interfere in other people's lives, who are meddlers, who don't want everybody to have the same rights. Because let's face it, a lot of the American church is infected with white Christian nationalism, which is a heresy. And Quakers don't usually use that term, but it is a heresy. If you worship a Jesus who wants you to punish people who don't believe the same way you do, then basically you're worshiping the culture, not Christ. Abortion rights, civil rights for people of color, for women, for people whose gender identities and sexual preferences are different from the mainstream, those people aren't as good as the rest of us. Where what real Christianity says is we are all, we have all sinned at some point or another. We all need to be made right with God. We all also need to remember that when we deal with each other. John Greenleaf Whittier, the very famous Quaker poet from the 19th century, once said that to worship rightly is to love each other. Margaret Fell, that goes back a ways. In the 1660s, actually this was around 1700. This was after George Fox had died, and she was left sort of by default as the founding mother of Quakerism, since the founding father had passed on. Margaret Fell wrote this wonderful letter in her extreme old age, complaining about the way that Quakers were beginning to become strict. We were beginning to insist on what would later be called plainness of dress. And after making the point that this is what Christ cried woe against, this legalistic outward sort of observance, that this is what we were supposed to be liberated from. She's talking about the colors of Quaker dress, and she says, but no, we must not be all changeable as the hills, but must all be of one color and of one hue. This is a silly poor gospel. And she was like nearly 70 at the time. You can almost hear this impatient old woman scolding people for departing into silly ways. The job of the church is not to be the legislature. The job of the church is not to throw stones at people. The job of the church is to show people God's love. And if I can't leave you with anything else this morning, let me leave you with that. The job of the church is to show God's love. And I think that our Quaker forebears, and indeed the earliest Christians, would agree with me.